ear piercings, specifically lobes. Lobe piercings are one of the most common piercings that are out there, especially in the United States. These piercings work really well whether you're male or female, old, young, somewhere in between. Unfortunately, these piercings are also the ones that are most commonly done with guns, which I do not recommend. However, that stated, lobes tend to also be a very resilient part of the body. Generally, lobes are one of the least painful piercings that you can get, and that is because it's really just a lot of soft tissue with not a lot of nerves in it. I swear earlobes are just like made to be pierced, which is probably why it's one of the most common piercings you can get. There are, of course, variations. For example, I have what's called a transverse lobe, which runs horizontal rather than front to back. Like a lobe, a transverse lobe doesn't hurt a lot, like it's not a sensitive area. However, it does run through a lot of tissue, which makes the healing process a little bit more complicated. We'll get to that in a minute, but first let's talk about placement. As long as you have an ear, there's a good chance that you will have the anatomy to get your ears pierced. Anatomy is not usually an issue when it comes to lobes. The most common issue with lobe piercings tends to be the piercings are done unevenly, so it looks completely different on one ear versus the other, which I can justify a little bit based on the simple fact that no two ears are the same. All symmetry is a lie. But as a piercer, I work hard to make sure that even if things are not perfectly symmetrical, they at least appear symmetrical. So in this video, I'm also talking about transverse lobes, which are a lot less common. Transverse lobes are anatomy dependent. You do have to have a bit of a thicker lobe to be able to support the jewelry. So if you have a really, really thin lobe, you probably wouldn't be a good candidate for a transverse lobe. So let's talk jewelry. You can get away with a lot in lobes. Because most of my clients are most familiar with standard butterfly back jewelry, that is what I pierce with. However, you can also use a barbell. Some people specifically request to be pierced with a hoop. I personally do not pierce with closed hoops just because I find that a lot of people struggle to heal with it. But in those cases, I have had people specifically request to be pierced with a horseshoe. And the lobes are an area where you do have a lot of flexibility as far as what gauge you pierce it at. Generally, when I pierce lobes and use a butterfly back, I pierce at 20 gauge, which is a very standard size. However, some people do choose to go larger, especially if they do plan on gauging them in the future. The largest I personally pierce at is 16 gauge, although there would really be no harm in piercing as large as a 10 gauge. And the fun thing about lobes is the jewelry is really only limited to your imagination. You can get away with a lot in lobes. I personally prefer the straight pieces for initial healing just because those usually heal a little bit easier than anything that has curvature. When we're talking about a transverse lobe, however, you're generally going to be working with a curved barbell to fit the shape of the ear and the shape of where it's being pierced. So let's talk about how it's pierced. Lobes are a very straightforward piercing. Unlike a lot of other piercings, there's not anything directly behind it or around it that you really have to work hard to avoid. It's a soft tissue, so it's really easy to slip a needle through. My personal preference is to put clamps on the lobe so that I have the tissue sort of pre-stretched and ready to go. Some people prefer to do it completely freehand. And then of course there are still lots of places that do it with a gun, which I do not recommend. Your piercer will have their own preference on if they use tools or not. And so we reach the most important part of any new piercing, and that is the healing and the aftercare. Again, lobes are pretty resilient. You can get away with a lot. I definitely still recommend keeping them clean with a saline solution, preferably a sterile spray saline solution. Because my shop does not currently sell sterile saline solution, the second best option is to make your own using a very low concentration of non-iodized sea salt with distilled water. Lobes are one of the quickest healing piercings. They don't usually get bumped around too much unless of course you're sleeping directly on them. And again, it's a soft tissue. It repairs really fast. So usually you're looking at about 8 weeks before you can pretty much treat it like a healed piercing. There are of course situations where healing may take slightly longer than 8 weeks, but 8 weeks seems to be a pretty good average. So let's say you have a lobe piercing and you've decided that you are done with it, you don't want it anymore. Lobes are really interesting in the fact that they tend to hold on to holes really well. I will say of any piercing, it is the one that people have been able to put back in years later more than any other piercing. So do keep in mind that if you get a lobe piercing and you do let it fully heal, there's a good chance that that hole will be forever. Just like with any piercing, it can over time fill up with oils and dead skin cells and may appear closed. But often with just a little bit of maneuvering, you can put an earring back in even if you've had it out for multiple years. This is not true for everybody, of course. But do be aware that it is very common that an ear piercing is forever, especially if it is fully healed when you take the jewelry out. Usually the scar isn't going to be super noticeable on an earlobe. Depending on the specific anatomy of your ear, it may just look like a simple fold in the ear. I've had a lot of clients come in that never had their ears pierced and it looked like they had, just from the way that their ear naturally curved. If you're a person who is on the fence about getting piercings, lobes are a great kind of starter piercing. The pain is pretty low. It is one of the most socially acceptable piercings to have regardless of your gender or your age. I personally do not pierce under the age of 10, but it is a piercing that some parents take their literal infants to go get. My recommendation would be to wait until you're at least around 6 or 7 just to make sure that the ears are large enough that you kind of have a sense of what they're going to look like when you are fully grown. At an infant, the ears are so small that it might look perfectly even, and then as the child grows up, they will start to look completely different. In any case, if you're not sure about if piercings are for you, I definitely recommend starting with the lobes. It will give you a sense of how your body reacts to being pierced, if you like the idea of having jewelry in, and it's also a great sort of starter piercing for learning how to take care of piercings. And if nothing else, it adds a little bit of sparkle and shine to kind of a boring, weird part of the body. I hope this video was helpful and informative to you. If it was, be sure to give me a big ol' thumbs up, and while you're down there, sound off in the comments below what you would like me to talk about in a future video. Also, while you're down there, be sure to subscribe to my channel because I post a new piercing video every Friday, and also whatever it is I do on Wednesdays. It's whatever. And I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye!